Hi there. Most people with C-PTSD don't even know that they have it, and many clients who come to see me with complex trauma histories actually come to see me for something else, one of the traits or conditions that I'm going to talk to you about in a few moments. So I invite you to watch on and to see if any of these traits or behaviours, symptoms, whatever you want to call them, resonate with you. I'll also be explaining at the end of the video how you can get hold of my 38 question quiz that will give you some indication as to whether you may have C-PTSD. It's not a formal diagnostic tool, but it could give you some food for thought, and there is a 12-page ebook guide with it that will give you some extra information about complex trauma and some ideas of what you can do if you think you do have it. I'm Amanda Craven, clinical hypnotherapist, psychologist, life coach, and one of my areas of specialism is complex trauma recovery. So let's just clarify a few things first. C-PTSD stands for Complex Post-Traumatic Stress Disorder. Trauma is normally something that we associate with a huge catastrophic event, and perhaps somebody being involved in a serious accident, in an earthquake, a military personnel being deployed to a war zone. Something big, and that is in most cases a one-off disaster or crisis that they have to deal with. In contrast to that, complex trauma is when there has been prolonged or repeated exposure to overwhelming situations or events. So these traumas are different. They may be perceived as smaller, which can sometimes be why people with C-PTSD don't even realise they have it, but I'll be talking a lot more about that in another video. But it is the repetitive nature of the traumatic exposure that makes the difference between complex trauma and trauma as in the big one-off event. Complex trauma is most often associated with experiences in childhood, adverse experiences I should say, but it's not specifically limited to children. There are adults who experience complex trauma, and that again will be a discussion for another day. So because in the main complex trauma is associated with children and young people, you can also hear it referred to as childhood trauma or developmental trauma. Before we go on to look in more detail at what actually constitutes complex trauma, let's have a look at some of the key symptoms that may be associated with C-PTSD. So many people with complex trauma, C-PTSD, may have a condition that has already been diagnosed by a medical professional, or they may have the traits that belong to a diagnosable condition. So let's have a quick look at what some of those conditions could be. So it could be ADD, attention deficit disorder, or ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, generalized anxiety disorder, depression or depressive disorders, OCD, or some other diagnosable condition that, as I say, may or may not already have been diagnosed. But in addition to that, there are many other things that somebody with a complex trauma history may struggle with. And this is a list, it's not an exhaustive list, but it gives you a good idea of some of those things that may be issues, and there may be some things that you can relate to that raise a little flag for you. So personal relationships can be very difficult for somebody with complex trauma history. holding down a job or progressing in your job, getting promotions. You may be extremely and chronically disorganized. You may be a people pleaser. You may have a substance abuse condition. You could have other addictions. You may have chronic indecision problems, really like a rabbit in a headlights. Even when asked to make the simplest of decisions, you can't do it. Procrastination is another one. Hoarding is very often linked back to childhood trauma. And self-esteem, low self-esteem, is frequent in clients with CPTSD. You may also struggle to relax, have extreme sensitivities. This could be to certain sounds or certain volumes of sound, could be to certain places or certain smells. You may have trust issues. There may be problems around boundaries, setting boundaries, maintaining boundaries, and panic attacks is frequently traceable back to childhood trauma. If any of this resonates with you, keep watching to understand more about complex trauma. So, all of the things that I listed on the previous slides are actually only symptoms. They are not the problem, and they are symptoms of this complex trauma, this prolonged or repeated abuse or neglect that took place often in childhood, but this is not exclusively limited to childhood abuse and neglect. So let's have a look at those in a little more detail. Let's start with neglect. This can be emotional neglect, which may mean a lack of hugs, of tenderness, tender words, expressions of unconditional love, reassurance, and feeling emotionally safe. It could be physical neglect, including undernourishment, inadequate hygiene, clothing or accommodation. It could be abandonment, intentional or not. There are cases where the child's primary carer is ill, dies, or is in some other way not intentionally absent and away from the child. But there are cases, of course, where there is a deliberate choice, but that in both cases that's abandonment. In terms of abuse, there are many types of abuse, and sometimes it can be difficult for somebody as an adult to actually recognise and acknowledge that what happened in their childhood did constitute abuse, and I will be talking more about that in another video. So this abuse could be emotional or psychological abuse, which could be name-calling, shaming, emotional blackmail, bullying, discrimination, inappropriate sanctions or punishment, restricting access to everyday requirements, including food and sanitary supplies, for example. It could be physical abuse, which would include hitting with an object, with a hand, or restraining. Sexual abuse covers a wide range of abuses within this category, from inappropriate touching and talking of sexual matters to young people, to forcing somebody to conduct a sexual act, and going, of course, to full-blown rape. Verbal abuse includes shouting, threats, explosive overreactions to a situation. Domestic violence, if this is witnessed by the child, whether or not they experience it themselves, this also constitutes trauma for that child. And last but not least, a child may have a parent or primary carer who has an addiction that affects their day-to-day functioning and behaviour. They may have a mental health condition that perhaps hasn't been diagnosed, or if it has been diagnosed, it's not being treated, or the treatment isn't being taken, and therefore this can lead to inappropriate behaviour and the other things that I've just mentioned, the abuse, neglect, abandonment, violence, etc. But also a parent or carer with anger issues or explosive, unpredictable behaviours for other reasons would constitute traumatic events for that child. In order to cope with an overwhelming situation or event, a person of any age is going to resort to trauma or threat response mechanisms that are innate to our body and brain. There is a very primitive, a very old part of our brain that is connected to all our senses, that is constantly scanning our environment to decide whether we are safe or not. And it's a very black or white thinking part of our brain. We are safe or we're not safe. There's no grey area in this thinking. This part of the brain is called the amygdala, and if it decides that we are not safe, then it will send messages in the form of neurochemicals into our body in order to prepare us for a threat response. Now, the threat responses can be flight, fight, freeze, and there's another one associated particularly with complex trauma, but I'm going to talk about that more in another video. So the main ones are flight, fight, or freeze. So first of all, we will attempt to flee, to escape. The second option, if the first one isn't possible, is to fight our assailant, fight the situation. And if that fails, then we may go into a state of freeze or some sort of collapse or fainting. It's important to know that these triggers and responses are designed to help us in short-term acute moments of danger, because all these chemicals that flood our body are there to help us have the ability to run, to fight, or if not, will encourage us to go into this state of collapse. However, in the case of complex trauma, of course, the situation, the danger, the overwhelming events are prolonged, are repeated, so there isn't any let up, and our system, our body, is constantly flooded with these chemicals that are designed to keep us in a state of high alertness. If we are not removed from that situation, then this state of hypervigilance, hyperarousal will continue and eventually will lead to illnesses and diseases. A lot of the symptoms and traits that I mentioned at the beginning of the video are actually behavioural symptoms. They are behaviours that we no longer want, that don't serve us. They maybe did serve us in the past, but they don't now because we're not in that same situation, so we call them maladaptive behaviours. And they can include the addictions that I mentioned, interpersonal problems, inability to trust, obsessions, phobias, all sorts of things that can result from that the behaviour continuing into adult life. So I'm now going to finish off by demonstrating to you how the things that happen to us in our past impact on our life as an adult and influence those unwanted behaviours that now we want to stop. So in order to understand what happened to us in our past and how past memories and subconscious or not of trauma impacts on our behaviours and well-being as an adult, I want to talk to you a little bit about the mind. I hope you can excuse my rather crude drawings. They get a little worse as the slides go on. I'm not a graphic designer, as you'll see, but I hope that these images give you an idea of how this works, how the subconscious mind works. So if you were to see your mind as a whole, like this circle, the top layer, representing around about 10%, is your conscious mind. That's the part of your mind that you use to make everyday decisions, to decide what you're going to wear, what you're going to eat for a meal, etc. Below that orange line, there is the subconscious mind, so that represents round about 90% of your mind. Now, this is where every experience that you have ever had is stored. Every memory, every smell, everything you've seen, every emotion, all this is stored within your subconscious mind. Right at the bottom there, beneath the thick blue line, is your deep subconscious. And this is where suppressed emotions, memories, experiences are stored. So things that we are not able to deal with at the time because they are overwhelming, either because we are very small and pretty much powerless, or we are overpowered, overwhelmed in some other sense. So this is where those sorts of tough experiences are stuffed down. Now, consciously, we may not remember these, or certainly we won't remember them easily, because they have really been stuffed down in order to protect us, in order to be able to deal with the extremely difficult situations. But, as we'll see on the next slide, the things that are stored in our deep conscious mind, deep subconscious mind rather, begin to seep through, a bit like toxic waste at the bottom of a river or a lake. After some time, that toxic stuff will make its way into the main body of water, eventually making its way to the surface and killing things as it goes through. So too, those stuffed down thoughts, memories, experiences in our deep subconscious begin to seep, first of all, into our subconscious mind, and at this point we may start to have niggles, we may be aware of feeling low or feeling anxious or feeling fearful, but have nothing to attach that to. And over time, that continues to seep into our subconscious mind, and then makes its way, the little wiggly arrows are supposed to demonstrate those experiences, those memories, making their way into that conscious part of our being, if you like, where we have habits and behaviours that are not desirable, that are not healthy or helpful to us. So hopefully that gives you an idea of how traumatic experiences may have been stuffed down into our deep subconscious, so consciously recalling them is difficult or impossible without resorting to hypnotherapy, for example, and then how they seep through, creating unwanted, undesirable states of mind, and then continuing to affect our choices, our behaviours, leading to all the things that I've mentioned on the previous slide. I really hope you found this video useful. I'll be making lots more videos on CPTSD in the future, so if you have any particular questions that you'd like me to cover, please pop them in the comments below and I'll do my best to cover as many of them as possible. If you want to get that 38 question quiz and the 12-page ebook that goes with it, that will give you some more information about CPTSD and what you can do if you think you have it, the link is in the description below. Thanks for watching and see you next time.